So today we're going to be discussing the future of network analysis using in the course of clinical psychology, talking a little bit about perils of network analysis in this field, some possibilities, and basically how we can be using it in the future. So we've brought together a awesome panel, and some of these are personal heroes of mine, so it's very exciting for them to all be here. So giving some basic overviews, network analysis has rapidly become a very popular tool for psychopathology research in the recent years. It's really become very popular in the clinical psychology realm very recently. So researchers have been stating or arguing that network analysis has an advantage over latent variable analyses or these classic models because symptoms likely causally influence each other, which violates an assumption of latent variable models. And instead, network analysis conceptualizes these disorders as systems of interrelated symptoms. And so these networks are attempting to map out these relationships and allow for examination of central nodes that could present important implications for treatment targeting or treatment planning in the future. And most research has examined data compiled across individuals, which doesn't take into consideration information across symptom associations within an individual across time. So some researchers, including some of the ones here on this panel, have also begun expanding these analyses into looking at idiographic networks, examining within individual symptom dynamics over time. And since the theme of this ABCT is technology, the use of text messages and web-based survey systems can also be used in network analyses, which is very, very cool. And so these methods can be helpful in adapting CBT on a regular basis, perhaps with client symptom networks. But there's also been some controversy in the field, such as wondering whether these networks can actually be replicated. So the replicability of psychopathology networks has been, in general, argued to be good by some, poor by others, again, by some of the people who are sitting here on my left. And so we brought together a lot of people who have a lot of expertise in methodology, network analysis, and also psychopathology to come and talk to you a little bit more about networks, how they can be used as we go forward, and what are some potential problems as we look forward to the future. So as we move on, I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, but before we get started with that, I just wanted to take a quick survey of the room. How many people here have done a network analysis with clinical psychology symptoms before? Great. Excellent. Hopefully all the hands up here went up. Great. And how many of you have just been kind of interested in learning about network analysis but haven't actually started using it yet in your research?
Those are the other hands.
Great. Perfect. Excellent. So we have kind of a good smattering, maybe like 50-50 of people who are interested and also people who have done some of their own research. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to introduce our panelists. Unfortunately, Aiden Wright is not able to be here at the conference today. He, due to the weather, had trouble making in and then had some water heater explosion problems. So maybe explosion's a bit dramatic, but he is not here with us today. And I'll let everybody else introduce themselves. So just kind of please briefly introduce yourself and tell us about your research related to network analysis. We can start on this side and move all the way around.
So I start?
Yes.
Okay, so, I'm Bob Kruger. I'm on the faculty at the University of Minnesota. That's who I am, research related to network analysis. So as Esther was saying, this has become a popular approach, in the psychopathology literature. I've always been very interested in quantification of psychopathology and in the idea of developing a formal quantitative model of psychopathology as opposed to a model derived primarily from, psychiatric fiat and supposed expertise. And so because of that interest in that general theme, I got interested in working with models that are classified under this rubric. And we published at least one paper, more forthcoming, kind of examining the extent to which in cross-sectional data, it is the case that the parameters at a very specific level that are derived from the things that are often called network analysis seem to be replicable at the level at which they're often interpreted, which is in terms of very specific parameter estimates. And I can say more about that as we get into that, but that's kind of my basic interest in it, at least research?
I'm Doug Stanley at the University of Missouri. Let's see. I'm mostly just a quantitative psychologist, and I've been doing social network analysis probably for 20 years, and then like graph theory. So this is kind of, when it started to be published, caught my interest kind of just by natural connections to other interests.
Morning, I'm Aaron Fisher. I'm from UC Berkeley. My interest is really in idiography, so that, study of individuals and the quantitative study of individuals. And network analysis, when I first started reading the papers coming out of Rich's lab and folks in the Netherlands, just really caught my excitement and my interest as a way to model individual human beings as systems, because it's really a systems kind of oriented approach. So, we have only one paper out, paper in Journal of Abnormal last year, but that's really our angle in our lab, is modeling individuals as networks.
Do I need that? I don't need that. My name is Rich McNally. I'm professor in the Department of Psychology, Harvard University, director of clinical training. I got interested in the networks after meeting Denny Boersboom a number of years ago when he was at APS and reading some of the papers he did. And then we wound up doing a study together on post-traumatic stress disorder with others here, including Don Robinow, who's in the audience. And Don was the lead author on a paper on complicated grief. And we've also done work with social anxiety disorder with Alexander Aaron, who's also here. Got a lot of collaborators in this business, I think, Obsessive compulsive disorder, we've done some work with Bayesian networks with those patients, and also with Alex and Emily Bernstein, breaking down processes of rumination, looking at rumination through the network lens. Did I leave anything out? Oh yeah, so we got some stuff with George Albers on time series analyses. Stay tuned on that one. It'll be presented at 10:15 on Sunday with Facebook and depression. And we've done work also with body dysmorphic disorder and working now with some eating disorder patients. So we've been kind of wandering all over the landscape of psychopathology. But I am most definitely a student of network analysis, not an expert. Here's the expert right here, ladies and gentlemen.
I don't need to introduce myself anymore.
No, as the cliche says, a man who needs no introduction.
Yeah.
Sasha Epstein.
Probably easier if you do this.
Yeah.
I don't have the voice of Rich. Hi, I'm Sasha Epskamp. I'm from the University of Amsterdam. I'm a methodologist and psychometrician. And with my colleagues in Amsterdam, I've been developing networks towards being a practical methodology. I've also really worked on trying to make it accessible and explaining what you can do and what you cannot do with network models, and also implement a lot of this in software. In my research, I've looked at the relationship between network and variant models and how to estimate network and time series data. And also about if you can use data-driven methods like bootstrapping to say something about the stability and accuracy of network models when you estimate them, and get some guidelines when you can and cannot say something. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with where we are right now. It works pretty well. There's a lot to do still, of course. Lots of challenges and pitfalls as well, so it'll be nice to discuss.
Great.
All right.
Perfect. And my name is Esther Tung. I am a graduate student at Boston University, and I will be your moderator today. So we're going to just start out with what are some current concerns of examining psychopathology using network analysis, and what are some pitfalls or dangerous situations to look for while conducting these analyses. Likely most of the people in this room, and what you've already heard from the panelists, know some of the strengths and the possibilities. So we'll take a look at some of the concerns, and obviously you can acknowledge some of the strengths as you're talking about the concerns as well. So I will give the floor to our panelists. Current concerns.
So I think the thing that has me most excited about network modeling remains actually network theory. And of course, and many people in the room probably know to split those, but many people might not take a moment to do that. And I think it's always important to separate the theory from the actual applications that we use. And the theory is really gripping to me. And if you read Denny's paper, the World Psychiatry paper from last year, I think, right? It's just a beautiful, fantastic paper. This idea of mutual reinforcing relationships, and that these are distributed processes and not derived from latent disease entities, and all of these kind of components I find really compelling. Where my concerns come up is the degree to which we represent that theory quantitatively. And I have some concerns that I've expressed in print, that I've expressed at ABCT and APS, and if you were unlucky enough to send me a cross-sectional network paper, you would get from me as a reviewer. Although in fairness, I signed my reviews, so then you can give me dirty looks later. I worry that the degree to which between subjects differences reflect this idea of reinforcement between nodes and all those kinds of details. But in fairness, I also don't know that the ideographic stuff that I do is even capturing that, right? So when I think about my concerns are how do we overcome these limitations? How do we get the applications closer and closer and closer to the theory? Because if we could do that, I think we'd be working with some really, really, truly fantastic quantifications of human experience. So
We're supposed to be talking about good things or bad things? Concerns.
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 Yeah. I intend to be a rambler. I think that was a concern, technically, right?
That's okay. I find it, by the way, very ironic that this panel discussion is occurring in the Calvin Coolidge room. The room, of course, he's the most famously introverted president in American history. He was at a dinner party one day, one time, and this one young lady says to him, "Mr. President, I'll bet I can get you to say more than 2 words at this dinner." He turns to her and says, "You lose." But I don't think this panel is going to be like Calvin Coolidge. We're in the wrong room, I think. But anyway, I think that as a clinical psychologist, I think one of the most potentially interesting things about the network analysis, but also one that is a combination of this potential strength, but also concern, is the issue about the centrality metrics. Because I worked in DSM-4 and the PTSD and the phobia committee, and one of the interesting issues here was to get rid of all those symptoms that are sort of non-specific. We wanted these quasi-pathognomonic symptoms, or the hallmark symptoms of PTSD or whatever it might be, things like maybe numbing or perhaps flashbacks, as opposed to things like sleep problems and concentration impairment, things of that sort. And now that you come up with this network analysis and a method to identify symptoms that are not necessarily, they might be hallmark symptoms, like anhedonia and persistent sadness and major depressive disorder. But then again, the high centrality symptoms might be something quite different. In fact, some of the symptoms that we were trying to get rid of in some of the diagnostic categories. I mean, there's an issue with the personality disorders people too. Someone might have 4 or 5 personality disorders all at once. You're trying to simplify things in such a way as to get hallmark symptoms. The high centrality symptoms are the ones that are highly connected with other nodes, bear many strong connections with others. And so the hallmark symptoms that we've always talked about in psychopathology are not necessarily the same thing as high centrality ones. And so at least theoretically, a little bunch of assumptions here, if you could target a high centrality symptom, and if the edges connected to that symptom are issuing from that symptom, and if you could turn that off, and if, oh boy, how many assumptions am I? About 4 of mine. And if it's you have a situation where they're not only something that is produce activation throughout the network, but is still doing it, maintaining it, not just initiating it, then if you turn off that symptom, you potentially would be able to have a beneficial propagating effect throughout a network and hasten the recovery of the patient. Now, that is a lot of assumptions here. One, of course, is that the whole thing about whether or not a high centrality node is in fact the source of activation, or not merely the recipient of the activation, in which case that's not going to do much good, right? It's like somebody's got a fire in their house and says, let's get rid of all this smoke, give me a fan rather than a fire extinguisher, right? That's the metaphor applies. But even if it is in fact issuing, the edges are issuing from that node, then you have one question, is whether or not you can actually target that node specifically. Some of these guys in the computer science field, I heard this term from Denny actually originally, but I think it comes from computer science. You got the fat hand problem, The idea is that what we'd like to do is kind of say, okay, pop, hit this particular note, and only that note. But sometimes it's that little fingertip we're doing. It's kind of like this, right? So if you were to give someone with sleep problems a benzodiazepine, well, you might not, it's not just maybe helping them sleep, deactivating that sleep node, but it's also reducing their anxiety. They're doing a lot of stuff at the same time. And of course, that presupposes not only that you could target that node, that you can actually deactivate it. So for example, how about something like emotional numbing in PTSD? You know, we know how to deal with fear, we know how to deal with psychophysiologic reactivity, we know how to deal with nightmares, it's exposure treatments that can target those symptoms. Numbing, a little more complicated one. So it's assumed that you could target that node directly, get around that fat hand problem, and it assumes that you can actually do it. It assumes that the node is the initiating connection. And finally, you got this the distinction between initiating and maintaining variables. So for example, let's take a common example. Someone's got social anxiety disorder, and they start drinking to sort of help themselves cope at parties and things like that. So they develop a drinking problem, but as they age, they lose a social anxiety disorder. You know, so now social anxiety may have been the thing that got their alcoholism going, but now the problem is that they got issues with withdrawal symptoms that keeps them drinking. So one question here is whether or not, let's say you activate a node from some internal or external source, and this is in fact a problematic node. If it's initiating but not maintaining, you might be able to turn off that node, but the fire is already burning. You know, the match is burned out, but now the house is in a conflagration, right? It's again another metaphor. So then trying to turn off the match means it's not going to help you very much. We've got to put out the fire because it's spread already. Distinction between initiating and maintaining variables.
Rich, I'm gonna
You're
ask
asking
you to
me
wrap
up. See, this is the Calvin Coolidge. You're gonna tell me you lose.
Thank you, Rich.
More than
But
two
anyway,
words.
what's that?
More than 2 words.
More than 2 words. Here, I lost. I tell you.
Can I quickly comment on that?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, I agree with this. I think there's also an interesting case that if all these things hold up, that you say that you need to have the subject for centrality, even then you can simulate like under an IC model, for example, and then you can see there's actually some work done by computational scientists in Amsterdam that even if that's all the case, and you still cannot intervene on the central nodes, or at least the central nodes will just flip back basically because they're all constant batting around.
Right.
Right. So then you can even show that you need to intervene on like intermediary nodes, which is very interesting. So even if that's all true, it's still not trivial.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really, we skipped I think like 2 or 3 questions ahead or so.
But that's okay.
Yeah, I already put the second question
Yeah.
up on there. Like, you know, it's kind of very
Yeah, so I think that is a real concern with networks, or in psychological networks, is that they look like networks. And that opens the door to doing all kinds of network stuff, also from social networks, but they're very different. And they're also based on data. You need to take it into account. You need to take into account the instability in the parameters, things like that, when you interpret these models. And many things that are trivial or that are done in graph theory, they don't necessarily really apply, or the bridge is not trivial at all.
Right.
That's the main concern, I think.
So we've kind of already been bridging between the first 2 questions here, the second being can social network analyses methods like centrality be applied to psychometric networks? So kind of any last words on these last 2 questions? Panelists that haven't spoken yet, I don't know if there's anything else you want to insert about either of those.
The ones that haven't spoken out yet. Oh.
Correct, correct. There was a modifier in there. About either current concerns or just whether you feel like methods like centrality can even be applied to psychometric networks. But.
So I'll say something. I think Aaron expressed the concern about cross-sectional analysis of cross-sectional data under the rubric that's traditionally called network analysis. So that doesn't necessarily need to be restated. But the one thing I was thinking about also when Aaron was speaking is sort of what are you trying to do ultimately in terms of your program of research, right? So Aaron is very interested in this very challenging but important problem of how to characterize people in an idiographically rich manner, right? Which is consistent with a lot of what happens in clinical case conceptualization, and is frustrated by, these kinds of rubrics that we're accustomed to from the DSM, I think, right? So part of the reason I got interested in quantification of psychopathology and developing more empirically based models of psychopathology is because the DSM rubrics always struck me clinically as not particularly useful. And some of that is my own interest in personality pathology, right? So because I'm interested in personality pathology and asked to see patients who had those kinds of issues, It's well known that the modal patient who meets criteria for one DSM-4 style categorical personality disorder will meet criteria for 3 or 4, right? So for case conceptualization purposes, that system just doesn't work particularly well in my clinical experience, and it was that clinical experience that drove my interest in that kind of area. But as my own sort of program of research and interests developed, I became very interested in, genetics, as some people in the audience will recognize. So I've done a lot of work in gene hunting kinds of studies, also moving into gene expression kinds of studies in my current research. And for those purposes, you need to work with tractable data in extremely large N's, because if you don't have something like that, it's sort of difficult to make sense of anything, if that makes sense, right? So that level of complexity that one sees as a clinical psychologist in terms of trying to work effectively with an individual patient, and realizing, right, that there is a lot of idiographic complexity in any person's life, right, that won't necessarily generalize from patient A to patient B and so on, which again I'm saying is very valuable in clinical case conceptualization, is a level of analysis that's fundamentally intractable when you're doing something like hunting for genes. So, briefly, there are millions of single nucleotide polymorphisms, each of which is having a very, very small effect. So to make that kind of problem tractable in a bioinformatics sense, right, because you're looking for polymorphisms that are relevant to human variation in general, you do need some sort of higher level summary variables just in order to make anything happen. And that is, sort of working is the other thing that I could say, right? So when we look at variables that are at a high level of abstraction and are more nomothetic in nature, like the personality trait of neuroticism, for example, that kind of bioinformatic problem is tractable, right? So we're now finding, individual SNPs that contribute to variation in that variable. So some of it, again, like I want to say, has to do with what it is you're trying to do, right? I admire what people like Aaron are trying to do, and I think that that's the kind of thing that I think would be extremely useful in the everyday work of a clinical psychologist who wants a principled way of thinking about, right, how to intervene with a particular patient in a way that reflects, the particulars of that particular person's, life and psychopathology. But that's a different problem, again, from something like trying to characterize at a genome-wide level, right, the sort of underlying risk factors, which are going to be multiple and numerous, for continuous variation in a population. And for that, I think you need a different kind of conceptualization. So that's sort of where my head is at about this stuff right now. It depends a lot on what it is you're trying to do in your program of research and where you kind of want to go with this.
Yeah, I'll try to condense it all down. I'm naturally cautiously optimistic about everything I do. So
Can I have some of that?
Yeah, so the network analysis really gets me excited because it's a new kind of paradigm to look at things. But the cautious part of me that makes me nervous. So it's a wonder I get anything done, really. But I think that part of the problem in psychology in general is we need to step back and do just a little better thinking about how we do science. Right? So if you look at the history of psychology, we have these periods when new methodologies are introduced, and psychologists are almost like a bunch of lemmings that just follow the methodology. Right? So structural equation modeling came out, everybody's doing structural equation modeling. And then growth mixture modeling came out, and it dominated the field. Right? Now you don't see them that much anymore. It's because we kept giving the same thing. It's like high, medium, low, right? It's the same. They're just parallel over time. And now it's network models, and you kind of see this in the journals when it's post-traumatic stress disorder, a network model. And it's not really a theory drive. It's not really a theory drive like the network model, right? It's just that we can do network models. And I think that we have to be really careful because kind of what Sasha said ties into the social network question is that we have, everything looks like a graph, everything looks like a network. So we think that we can do everything that we can do in one domain and then it means the same thing. Right, and at the bottom level, we could turn every data set into a network, right? Where it's just every observation's a node, and the links between them is just the distance, the Euclidean distance, or any kind of distance we want to do, or the correlation between observations instead of variables. And so you can take it to the extreme and see, well, that's kind of ridiculous. And so we just need to be careful that we're not just doing ridiculous things, which I don't think that we are, but I think that sometimes we get so excited about things. So if I think about how it's applied to psychopathology, the first question I ask is, well, psychopathology needs to make and I can say this because I'm not a psychopathology researcher, so I can just say whatever I want.
You guys can do it.
Right. So the question is do we really believe that these disorders come from a common factor model, right? Is it really that we're at Missouri, we're big into addiction and alcohol use disorder. So is alcohol use disorder really come from a common factor model? There's 11 items on it, right? And so if it comes from a common factor model, there's like great work that you guys show, then it should look like a complete network, right? If everything has the exact same loadings on your factor. If it doesn't look like a complete network, then we have a problem. Either it doesn't really come from a common factor model, which is kind of arbitrary, right? Because it's a latent variable. It's kind of just amorphous. We can create whatever we want. But if that's the case, then we have, I think it all comes back down to the measurement error. I think we do it and we have a paper that's kind of showing that, like, we can replicate the common factor model through all the, like, in this case, alcohol use disorder studies, but the order of if you look at the IRT characteristic curves, the ordering of the difficulty of the items are basically random across all the studies. So what that tells us is that we kind of have this false replicability of the common factor model. And instead of, the real problem is we're doing poor measurement, like, we're just doing poor data collection, right? So we need to, like, spend more time, like, working on how we collect the data, how we assess these items to begin with, instead of hoping that a new methodology is gonna come and like solve all of our problems as a panacea. So the real issue is, like, we are just like, oh, well, we have this inventory, it's been around for 50 years, it's well established, it's psychometrically, validated. But it's really, like, maybe not the best thing to use for network models, or maybe even common factor models. And we just don't, I think we just need to slow down a little bit. So my biggest concern is, like, we get out over our skis, and we're just like, start doing things. And it's like, so, but I also think that I'm like, I'll just go ahead and offend everybody. I also think the network models are really exciting, because I'm not super excited or a big fan of, like, latent variable models. I think latent variable models are a little bit sloppy. So, and that goes all the way back to when they were introduced. So, like, network models, I'm like, yeah, network models. I'm like, oh, come on, network models. Right, so I'm just, like, really excited, but nervous.
So
nervous because you've offended everybody. You're
No,
gonna he's gonna get in a gang fight. He's gonna be the only member of his gang.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So, I mean, if I can paraphrase what I think Doug is saying, precision in the measurement of more molecular constructs, right, is going to help with this entire endeavor, right? So something like, not just, have you experienced tolerance? I mean, that's a gross oversimplification of how those assessments work, but something to that effect, right? So
Exactly.
take the individual elements and measure them with greater precision, right? And then be able to say something more compelling about the individual elements. But I would say, Doug, that then what you're doing is a latent variable model, because what you're doing is having multiple indicators of the individual elements built in a hierarchy, right? So I don't think there's any way around the concept of latent variables, right? They're the most useful construct in all of science, basically, because what they're doing is summarizing the covariance among indicators and thereby creating more reliable units for our inquiry. There's just no way around the need for reliability. And I think that's the essence of what it is that you're pointing towards.
Right, I agree.
So quick pause. I'm just going to pause real quick. You've heard kind of opening statements from everyone, so these are kind of, you can kind of see what their opening positions and where we're kind of starting at. So I'm going to move us into one of our other questions, which we'll let you continue talking about it, but it'll be, should researchers be modeling psychopathological symptoms with or without latent variables? Since we're already here, we'll go ahead and continue talking about this question.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
First of all, I wanted to say that I often have this kind of experience where I show up at places like ABCT and I push for idiography, and then I often get really valuable, sometimes pushback or contextualization, or and what Bob said a few minutes ago really was a great example of that. It's just kind of, one size is not going to fit all for anything. So, you do always just want to reiterate and double down on, you want to know your research question and apply the right methods for the right question. I also love the idea, we talk about this in our lab all the time. We use the word atomization. I don't know if that's the best word, but this idea of trying to get down to the kind of like the quanta. I know that's a very grandiose word to use, but just for lack of a better one, like, what are the quanta of psychological processes? What are the bits that we can't break it down any further? And wouldn't it be nice if we could build our science back up from those bits? But and I definitely think idiography is one way to try to get at that. So, you moved the question.
Sorry, we were talking about latent variables, so I figured I might as well put that one up there.
Well, it said between subjects within subjects. So my concern about the between within thing, my concern is relatively simple. Is variation in means the same thing generalizable to variation from means? And what that means is that, right, so when we do cross-sectional between subjects data, we're talking about the distance from the mean. You calculate a bivariate correlation, and this your intro stats class, right? And you take the deviation of each observation from the mean and the degree to which the deviations in X agree or disagree with the deviations in Y, and you get your correlation, right? So this is, it's not a rank order statistic, but this has to do with rank order. This has to do with how everyone's piled up in your sample. So does your distance from the mean on depression and anxiety, so you're high in the sample on both, so, does that reflect how depression and anxiety unfold for you in your own life? As you're more depressed, are you more anxious? Yes or no? And so, and what we find in our lab more than anything else is it's just different for everybody, and sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And so that's, also one of my main concerns. That's, a big motivator for the research that I do, and so the correction for that has been for us to do these ideographic models. However, I also have a great deal of concern with those. You talk about measurement precision, you talk about generalizability from one person to another. If two people have a 0.45 correlation between two nodes. I was just kind of arguing with Aiko Fried about this on Facebook yesterday. Is that correlation the same thing? Is that, epistemologically, is that the same knowledge about the people? I don't really know. Also, I'm just going to squeeze one more quick comment in it. We rely on this stationarity assumption in time series and ideography. So we rely on this assumption that we collect data, and that data doesn't generalize to a population, but instead it generalizes to that person. I don't know if that's a good assumption. So our lab has actually taken a kind of a hard right turn into machine learning and doing prediction modeling in our time series data to try to hold ourselves accountable. Be like, are the predictions we're making, the assumptions we're making, descriptions we're giving, are they real? Are they viable? Are they good? Because I think we need to know that before we put any kind of weight behind saying you should model this network, take this network, and use it on a patient.
So sorry, we've been obviously the answers have crossed a bunch of different questions.
Yeah, sorry.
So no, they did see the questions ahead of time, so that's probably why they're jumping the gun. But we'll finish this question about kind of between subjects data and within subjects data that I currently have up on the screen, and then we'll maybe move back into latent variables after that. So sorry. No worries.
I'll comment on a few different topics. What Doug was saying, I agree with that. Well, not that research on lemmings, but I mean, these models are very sophisticated, they're very complicated, they're very high dimensional. So it's not trivial, you need to know what you're doing, and that's really important. I think that people realize what they're doing and what can go wrong and what can go right, and investigate it. But I think that's important. Also, you mentioned one thing, I think it relates to the validity of items. It's also always an important item. In the machinery or the software package, you can throw anything in there, you get anything out, you get a network out. It looks like a network, doesn't mean it is a network, doesn't mean it can be latent variable, for example. And also the items, they can either be valid or not. You don't know. That's not intrinsic to the method itself, it's intrinsic to the data set. And you really need to think about these things. And especially one thing in network analysis that we've been seeing is that the data set that's been used for network analysis are actually very inappropriate for network analysis because they're constructed with a latent variable in mind. And you actually don't want to have like a high chromax alpha because then you have redundant nodes in there. They just predict each other while they're connected because they're a copy of each other. It's not interesting. I think in relation to the measurement error points that Bob made, that's important. I don't think the solution to measurement error is always a latent variable. And there's a very interesting preprint now from Magner and Jula that's actually entitled Worse Than Measurement Error, where she shows that if you model measurement error with a latent variable, even though the latent variable is not true, so latent variable is not real, you might actually get worse results than you would have done if you didn't model the measurement error at all. So I think that's an interesting point of view. I also think that measurement error really is something you need to take into account. Again, it has to do with how you phrase the items, not specific to the model, it's specific to the questionnaire. All right, then to the within between. No, I agree with what Aaron said. I mean, ideographic networks are completely different from cross-sectional networks. They tell you something different. They tell you something about deviations from the mean, where the cross-sectional network, between subject network, tell you something about deviations of the mean. And this is different. I think the real challenge moving forward is to try to integrate these levels of analysis, because you cannot just ignore the pre-subject effects. You would miss things like smoking causes cancer, or childhood trauma causes something later in life. Where if you ignore the idiographic results, you miss things that people are different. So that's a real challenge still, to try to integrate these. I don't think we should ignore the cross-sectional level, but yeah, that's my point. I think that's all.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Yeah, so one thing though that I do want to sort of amplify about what Sasha's saying, at least in our experience of working with these kinds of approaches, is the thing about, if it is the case that the indicator variables are highly intercorrelated, then it follows that the partial correlations among those indicator variables will be unstable, and that's been understood, for a long time, right? When I was taught regression, it was called the bouncing betas kind of problem. So I think that's really intriguing to think about, right? So, right, when things are highly correlated, it's very difficult to, because what's left over, right, is the residual of everything that's in the network. And those residuals are tiny chunks of variance. So it's sort of ironic in the way that it works, right? So to the extent that symptom indicators are highly correlated, they're not necessarily the best sorts of variables for this kind of approach, which is going to work better, I think, and be more stable when it's the case that the indicator variables are less correlated. And so there's some fundamental challenge there about the nature of psychopathology, in which one thing that we definitely understand about psychopathology, at least based on how it's been traditionally conceptualized and assessed, is that everything's correlated with everything else, right? That's the so-called comorbidity problem. So there's a sense in which the domain that we're studying is not really suited to the kind of methods that people are now applying to it under the rubric of network analysis. Again, traditionally studied, based on self-reports or interviews, studied cross-sectionally. And so in some ways I think the solution to this, puzzle in terms of like how we've traditionally been looking at this and what we would like to do in the clinic really is in this other way of thinking about it, which is that we are interested in some of these idiographic patterns that aren't well captured by cross-sectional data of that sort. So I guess I just wanted to amplify that point about high intercorrelations are sort of incompatible with the idea of looking at partial relationships, and maybe get your perspective.
Yeah, I'll quickly comment on that, because what you see if you have regression model, you have highly intercorrelated predictors, you get this bouncing betas problem, right?
Yeah.
That's true in the network also. In networks you typically need a much higher N than you have in a typical regression study.
Right.
And what you can do, and that's also why it's so important to always do, is you can simply bootstrap and look at the results, and bootstrap is one way to do it. There are some new ways that they use Bayes analysis, I think it are better even. And then you can see the instability in that. And if you have a high enough N, you should be able to overcome that. And you see that also. I mean, you see in network models, even with highly intercorrelated items, that at some point these coefficient intervals become very small. Especially if you have like N is over 1,000, maybe even 10,000 or so. But that's, you should always take that into account.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And it may, in fact, then require extraordinary resources and sample sizes, which is what we learned in genetics, right? So in human genetics of complex, sort of continuous kinds of variables, like complex late life health conditions, like type 2 diabetes, things of this sort. What was learned very quickly was that the effect sizes of the individual single nucleotide polymorphisms are so small that we really do need about 1 million people to really hope to find something in the discovery sample. And although I know that sounds kind of nutty to this crowd potentially in terms of like what you could collect in your own lab, we did do this, and let's call it human behavioral genomics, right? Very quickly learned around 2010 or so, after everybody kind of got their initial GWAS data sets around 2008, that we were not finding stable things. And that's how we began to form extremely large consortia. And that worked. And it really started to work once we hit about 1 million observations, right? So the papers that are now going to be coming out in Nature Genetics, there are two very exciting ones. There's one on substance use disorders that was led by Scott Breeze, my colleague at Minnesota, and also my other colleague at Minnesota, James Lee, led the third educational attainment GWAS, which is a remarkable achievement also. But those discovery samples are in the 1.2 million-ish range, and they're finding hundreds of SNPs that are credible, right? So my point is, I think Sasha's right in terms of what might be required to make these kinds of inferences. And maybe it's the situation where really we do have to pull together a lot more data than we thought we had to get at the questions that we're really trying to answer.
Yeah, I don't think we need 1 million people.
Well,
with genetics, you also have that the effect is really small, so you need to
That's
protect
right.
that. but yeah, if you have like 1,000 or 10,000 people, usually you'll see pretty small effects, or pretty small confidence intervals, and you should be able to interpret that. One thing I think that we have learned is that these methods that come from machine learning, where you have this P is larger than n probability, so more variables than the amount of data you have, the amount of cases. And that's where they work, under the assumption that things are sparse. And then they apply this to estimate networks of 300, 400, maybe even 1,000 nodes. And we've learned in psychology that's simply something you cannot do because these networks are not that sparse as they are there. Right, so that's why we've moved toward networks of 30, 40, maybe 50 nodes. Requires sample size much larger than the number of variables. So that's really important. And if you do the bootstraps, or at least you do some form of stability analysis, you should see that.
I think with, I was gonna say with the between subjects and the within subject, like one thing that we've been working on is like, it's almost certain even in cross-sectional data that people aren't coming from the same network. If you just look at the response patterns. So we've been working on putting like a mixture model on top of kind of the network analysis, which seems to be working, or seems to be promising. Working loosely. It does things. And I think, but back to what Aaron said, I think it's really important, like just the notion that you wanted, in this case, use machine learning to make sure that you're getting accurate predictions. That's something we forget a lot about in psychology as well. So it's a more general thing we should think about in all of our models, even like a regression model. Like we're reporting like significant effects and stuff, and we have R squares, 0.05, and then things are significant, but we have significant effects without like any kind of accurate prediction. And I think at some level that should be concerning. It's not that prediction should drive the model above theory, but there is some question about how good a model is if it can't predict anything. Back to your original data. And then I think, touching back on what Bob said earlier, I do agree about latent variable models. I think that as they're conceptualized, especially like by Moulet's book, which is my favorite like factor analysis book, I mean, you should think about the items as being like a random sample from a pool of items that all measure the whatever construct we're assessing. The problem is we don't like operationalize what the theory of factor model, like factor analysis, says how we should do things. So I think that it's not that latent variables are bad. I think it's our implementation of our measurement of items are poor, and it's not an indictment of any particular method. It's just an indictment of our. We just need to. It's so hard to slow down and collect good data, because that's an impediment to getting publications and everything that we recognize as the coin of the realm. But at the same time, it's the most critical thing. So I just think we have to be more careful.
All right, any last thoughts on either the value of networks based on between subjects versus within subjects data, and then also whether we should be modeling these symptoms with/without latent variables? Last thoughts?
Just real quick on the latent variable thing. I really like what Bob said about neuroticism, because it recontextualized a little bit for me something that, some data I've been sitting on for a while, because I've been trying to figure out exactly the right way to package it and send it all out, send it out to all of you. We have some data where we looked at kind of a subsection of the high top model, and we looked at it ideographically. We've been sitting on this for a while now, but about 45 people, and you try to find that model, and you aggregate everyone's data, and you get this beautiful NAPA thing, going back to Brown, Torpedo, and Barlow 98, and all the way up through all the stuff that's been done, the really cool stuff that High Top's doing these days. So you get that. It's really clean, it's a beautiful fit, and all that kind of stuff. But then you take its ideographic data, right? It's time series data. So you do P technique, as Cattell called it, just within individual factor analysis. And I think one person, I'd have to grab my laptop, I think one person had a 2-factor structure, and everyone else had at least 3 factors and up to 6, I think 5 or 6. And they're like arousal factors and avoidance factors, and NA and PA, and sometimes NA and PA are in the same factor, so they're unidimensional. Sometimes they're in 2 factors, so they're bidimensional, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this idea of, well, what is the factor structure of psychopathology? And because if you're looking at it through one lens, the nomothetic lens, even with my own data, you get what a lot of other people are publishing and have been since 1998. But you look at it through a different lens, and you get a very different answer. And I think my reluctance to publish this data has been because my initial instinct was to say the ideographic lens is the right lens, and then I go to conferences and I listen to Bob and I listen to Rich and I talk to Sasha and Denny and I doubt myself and then I just wonder like what is the truth, you know? And so it's just all very complicated, and sometimes your scale is going to change the answer, the scale of the analysis, temporal scale, measurement scale. And then, of course, this idiographic nomothetic is a little bit more of a dramatic lens shift. But, you know, what is right and what is true and what is accurate might jump around on you.
So, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
So, what do you do with the idiographic complexity? What do you do with it, right? So, like, I mean, you could publish it, right? And you would say each of these 45 people has a fairly unique pattern, right? And so then, what's that? Like, where do you go with that? I mean, I'm being sincere here, right? Like, I think that there's something very important in what you're trying to do there, but I don't know. Let's put it this way: what you're doing is awesome, and it makes me really anxious in terms of my own time, right? Because I know that if I went down this path, I'd probably end up in a similar territory, and I'd be sitting on stuff like that and not quite know how to proceed. And then I get anxious about, let's call it, I don't know, like the hermeneutic trap or something like that, right? So here we are at ABCT, right? So this is a place in which presumably psychotherapy is a scientifically based endeavor, right? As opposed to a humanist, for lack of a better word, let's call it hermeneutic kind of endeavor, right? That the crucible of psychotherapy is so complex and so intractable that the idea of applying scientific principles to such an intimate human interaction is just not a good idea. Right, there are people who believe this, right? You guys know what I'm talking about, right? But plenty of people who, you know, adopt a rubric like, you know, psychodynamic or whatever, do think that there's some problem like that there. And, you know, I have to be honest, like I have some sympathy for that way of thinking about things based on my own experiences as a clinician, that there's something there that's very difficult to quantify, right? And I don't necessarily want to go down that road, but these are the things that make me kind of anxious. Like how do we render that problem tractable in a scientific sense? Because we might want to say something like, okay, the kind of P analysis produces, I don't know, let's say 3 basic patterns or something like that, right? Some people fit the nomothetic pattern, some people fit this other pattern, some people fit this third pattern, right? But then we're returning to a nomothetic level analysis to say that in the P space, right, there's some other set of patterns that are replicable. But the way you portrayed it is each of the 45 people is pretty unique.
Yeah.
And that's
So Aaron,
the
I'm going
challenge.
to, move us on to a new question. I'll let you answer how you...
I can't answer that question.
I'm going to let you answer how... I think you'll be able to kind of work it into this next question. So I'll let you answer about how you sleep at night. So they've already all kind of touched briefly on this throughout kind of their answers, but how can claims made based on network analysis be validated in practice, whether it's centrality or some things we are kind of now touching about? Basically, we are arguing a lot about methodology here and like how complicated it is, but like how can we validate these either assumptions or things that we are proposing to be important in our practice, whether it's therapy or assessment or otherwise?
Okay. I'm going to answer that, but I'm also going to shoehorn in an answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think out of sample testing and forward prediction that's where my mind is at right now, right? So, you know, can a model make a prediction, and can that prediction, you know, can you test its accuracy? So we've, Peter Soyster's sitting here, and he's brought substance abuse research into my lab, and that's been cool for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that I've been most excited about is that it gives me it happened or it didn't happen target. Somebody smoked a cigarette, drank a drink, or they didn't. So we've been doing evaluations of our prediction models on that, right? So, you know, likelihood to, and then you could use area under the curve and precision, metrics like that, you know, sensitivity, specificity. So I think that that's one way, that's just one answer, right? Directly testing your models, what do they predict, and then are your predictions any good? And to be honest, our predictions tend to be pretty good, but I'll also tell you some of them are junk. We have a handful of folks in our smoking study for whom the AUC, the area under the curve, is like just around 0.5. That's random chance, right? So it's like, didn't work. But then we have some folks in the 90s, in the 80s, right? So real quick, I think I have a pretty brief answer. It really is. So I actually, you know, because I do lean so hard into this whole idiographic thing, and sometimes I can get pretty revved up about it. People, I think, in this room have seen that. I think people sometimes mistake that's all I'm interested in. I'm actually interested in nomethetics and generalizable conclusions. I actually just think idiography is the window to that, or the door to that. I'm looking to try to find generalizable things at the micro and the most macro. The macro level, I'm absolutely hoping that enough people start doing this work, not just me, Aiden does some of it, or some other people, but that all of you start doing this kind of work, and then we can aggregate and do meta-analyses and et cetera, and start to find some kind of nomethetic patterns where we can say, well, this person fits into this bucket or that. I also have this hope, this belief, it's really grandiose, but I said it before, I hope that some of us can land on some quanta, that we can drill down and find some kind of like really core processes or elements or components of humanness, human psychological functioning, and that those will be generalizable, right? And that the idiographic work is kind of a way to get into those things. We measure people to find out the aspects of people that we can then generalize from person to person. I don't know if that makes sense as an answer.
Yeah, but, first of all, I'm not so sure about driving down to the quanta. I'm a little bit worried about the reductionism there as well. I mean, some of the important patterns may be emergent phenomena. And so even when we get down to the little bits, those quantum things that make us human, so to speak, I mean, what makes us human? Maybe some sort of emergent properties. We've got to hit it at the right level. But in terms of the question you're asking here, at least in principle, that if you're able to target, even with a fat hand problem, I mean, so there's an issue about targeting one node versus maybe targeting that one and possibly a couple of closely connected ones with it versus targeting something else, which is low in centrality. Whether that makes a difference, either at the level, whether you're getting it from cross-sectional or from time series analyses. So theoretically, that should work. So I think there's ways of testing those predictions. I mean, one way of doing it, of course, although this makes me a little uneasy, would be to start out with targeting the low centrality nodes. And typically those should not have much of an effect. You might turn off that node, but you still got a highly impaired person on your hand. So that's a little, in principle you could do that. And you'd find better effects, more quicker beneficial effects, theoretically, if you turn off or turn down the volume on a high centrality versus low centrality node. I think largely, I think this question is a very important one, because if any of this is going to matter to the practical field of clinical psychology, is it going to be a difference maker? If doing a network analysis, whether it's time series or nomethetic, what have you, will it actually will it make a difference? Will it be a difference maker? Will it have incremental clinical validity? Will it help us to do our job better? There's the big theoretical question. You talk about the network theory versus network practice and methods. Sure enough, but what is William James would call it? What is the cash value of the approach? Will it help us to help people reduce pointless suffering better than our current methods, whether it's latent variable or categorical diagnostic? I think all of that's in the background of everything we do, and that's the big question we got to answer. Otherwise, the clinicians are going to say, "You want me to do what kind of regularization procedure on this, or Bayesian network?" We're going to say, "Yeah."
Thanks, but no thanks.
Thanks, but no thanks. Yeah.
Jumping back in. We have a paper that will be out soon in Brad, where we did an open trial of personalization of CBT. And we didn't quite use network analysis where I think you're accustomed to seeing here. We did something that Peter Molinar calls dynamic factor analysis, but it really looks very much like a network. And in fact, the pictures that I put in the manuscript look like networks. And then we built an algorithm. So what we did was, this is not ready to scale right now, but we had a clinician from the local Oakland area as part of our team, as Jonathan Barkin. And I wanted a practicing clinician to be a part of this research from day one, because I wanted to embed in the project the idea that at some point we could scale this.
Yep.
And what became very clear was we had to build some algorithms, and we published that in PLOS One. I don't know if people have seen that, but so we take the data. There's all sorts of fancy things we do with it, all these idiographic, multivariate time series, blah blah blah, fancy talk, and then we push it through an algorithm, and we make treatment selection recommendations. And now it's an open trial, only 32 completers, so there's some major caveats, but it did really, really well, and especially it did well in terms effects per unit time, where we were able to shorten up therapy because we only gave people the stuff we thought they needed. And so I think stuff like that can
Yep,
provide
exactly.
some proof of concept.
Exactly. Yeah, Wolfgang Lutz in Germany is also operating in a general same theme as well. Yeah, so there's people are starting to answer that question.
If anyone wants to make one last response about this, I'm going to have us do one more question after this, and then I'll open it up to the floor to take some questions from the audience. But, who wants to start with this?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that in principle you can always use experimental design to test any kind of hypothesis, and that's what we do in psychology. It's hard in practice because of fat finger problems,
Yeah.
like that. In principle, that should be doable, and especially even if we can follow people their entire life, every millisecond on everything in their life, it's still observational data, so you still don't know exactly if people leave. But there's another thing you can do, and that's actually you can also test these kinds of questions theoretically. So we discussed the Ising model. You can actually just simulate that and see what happens. There's another paper that came out, or pre-conducted, that came out last week by Fabian de Blander, where they just looked at DAG, so they just looked at what is the real structures in direct acyclic graph, like a SEML. And then if you do that, and then you look at what would be the corresponding Markov fields, you look at the centrality, then the centrality actually was also pretty poor, because you assume the model was DAG. It really just relates to what you assume your model is, and you can theoretically model that, and then you can also investigate it in that way. That's also, I think, an interesting way forward to look at this even without data.
Great. So the last question from me is for, basically, if a researcher was interested in conducting psychopathological network analyses, what would your practical recommendations be? What kind of data set should they have, for example? Should they use latent variables, time series, continuous variables? For all of the budding or current network analysis researchers out there, basically, what are your best practice recommendations? And also, I guess you can dream big and say what your ideal data set would look like as well.
I think this completely depends on the theory and your idea about what you want to test. And if you want to look at something between subjects, maybe the effect of childhood trauma or something like that, then you're not going to do a network study. If you want to look at mood fluctuations from day to day, you want to do a time series analysis, because then the cross-sectional data won't tell you anything. If you want to make a network, then it doesn't make sense to have very redundant copies of variables in there, like 5 times asking the same thing. It really depends on what you want to do, what kind of data you have. That's really the first step. And after that comes all the usual stuff like IN, liability or validity, things like that.
Yeah, that's the answer. Well, that is the answer, right? But so that's definitely the answer. But one thing I want to sort of add to that is, I really like what Aaron was saying. I'm going to check out that paper in Brad, because that clinical utility angle on it is, I think, the thing that I think is, and Rich was saying something similar, right? Like that's where this could be really exciting, right? Like let's call it network theory, right? So basically, what you would do is try to figure out a way to help clinicians with this problem that I definitely encountered a lot as a clinician, which is I did not like DSM-based case conceptualization because it didn't help me to understand my patients very well. And now again, like I was asking for complex personality disorder cases because that's what I'm interested in clinically. So okay, take that with a grain of salt. Like those are not easy people to conceptualize, period. But okay, with that caveat in mind, that's why I started searching for something more. And I think that's maybe where some of your motivation is coming from too. And I think that direct connection to clinical utility, in spite of the limitations of modest N and so on, but even user acceptability kinds of things, even to generate data that suggests that some modest group of clinicians found this to have some utility because case conceptualization was richer or more effective, and even if it's just some stories, right, some vignettes about how by collecting some sort of assessment data, by applying something that's a little more idiographic in nature, right, than a sort of, I don't know, MMPI profile or something like that, right, by doing something that's more of this flavor, clinicians found it more acceptable, patients found it more tailored to their own, sort of needs and problems. I think that's a really good angle on how to move this all forward, because I think everybody would find that kind of exciting and interesting and engaging. And I think some of the limitations would become clear after a while, but I think there would be a little bit of a snowball effect there on what's possible, because you're coming right at that frustration that I think many of us feel clinically, right? Where we want something that better captures our patients' real lives, and we need to do it somewhat efficiently, right? We don't have, unless we're really doing analysis, like we don't have huge amounts of sessions to try to figure out the person's idiography in our own, sort of mind and experience with them. So there has to be sort of an assessment approach that gives us some information. Yeah, I think that's a really good angle on how to move this whole kind of thing forward for practical clinical purposes.
Just really quick, I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I just want to say we ran a specialty clinic, which is what we call our training component at UC Berkeley for the graduate students. For a year last year, we had 10 clients and our Berkeley supervisors, and people liked it. Clients tolerated it, supervisors really liked it. I run a private practice on Saturdays. I'm doing it with my private practice clients. I like it a lot. So there might be something vignette-y to actually, as you say, to write up. But we're trying that. What we're trying to test, does it work in the real world? How do we feel about it? How do the clients feel about it?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on Bob's comment there about the DSM and doing clinical work based on the DSM. If we think about the pre-DSM-3 background of what was in AABT, Jerry Davidson, Marvin Goldfried, functional analysis, functional behavioral analysis. They're very much similar to network analysis in the sense that the focus is on the relations among the different variables or the different problem behaviors, whatever you want to call it. And so in some sense, we've sort of come full circle in a larger conceptual sense that actually predates Bob Spitzer's categorical implicit disease model of DSM-3. And so network analysis in some ways is a much more computationally sophisticated, obviously, approach to doing something that people in the society have talked about a long time.
Speaking of full circle, it turns out that in psychometrics, people have been doing this in the 30s already, and then we sort of forgot about that in psychometrics.
But also part of that has to do with you have with some of these models. I mean, like Isaac was a physicist in the early 20th century. A lot of these sorts of things were the computer scientists just had to catch up to some of the graph theorists in some sense as well. So you've got mathematicians, statisticians, conceptualizing these things, and then finally they're able to work out algorithms and having the computing power, the hardware, to address these sorts of issues.
Yeah, it's all very combinatorial and demanding.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things we've been working on is taking like diagnostic item sets and trying to reduce them to like how can you get more efficient diagnoses from fewer items, and then feeding those into supplementary analysis. And at the end, we've actually started using decision trees to try. So we haven't kind of this discussion leads us to believe we could reduce the item sets, build a simpler network, so we're not trying to look at all the nodes that are connected, and then from that maybe come with a decision process based on some of the network statistics. Although I'm a little bit suspicious, like I don't know if centrality is going to be, or at least the common measures of centrality that we're using are going to answer that question. But there's a whole plethora. I mean, there's tons of centrality measures. It's not just the 3 or 4 that like there's like 60 in the literature. So I think there's a lot of opportunity if we especially focus on this efficiency. Because what's the point? Otherwise, we're just like twiddling our thumbs and like our ivory tower saying how we do all these models if it doesn't make its way out to the street. I guess.
Great. Last thoughts before we turn it to the audience? All right. So you've heard them talk about a variety of different topics in network analysis at this point. So I wanted to give a chance for the audience to ask any questions that either you felt like you didn't get an adequate answer for, or just really anything you want to pick these experts' minds about. So, yeah.
I want to come back to the within between subjects thing, just because we didn't spend enough time on it.
Greg, didn't we argue about this summer enough?
Well, so what I was thinking since this summer, the factor analysis community sort of went through a similar set of questions a while ago and ended up with these 3-way factor analysis, these parafact kinds of models, in which. So yeah, the factor analysis community went through this, and they ended up with these 3-way factor analysis kinds of models, which are effectively like mixed effects, where you model with some factor structure within each person or within each unit, and then on a different dimension, which could be across subjects, you model some commonalities across the networks. I'm wondering if you guys are starting to think about using sort of these like two-level network modeling, or something where you're actually combining the idiographic in between subjects to make some grand networky pronouncements.
So the hang up I have there, and Laura Bringman and Eiko Fried did a little podcast actually on this very topic a few months ago. And it really, if you, I think Eiko has it on his website, and it's like, no, and Laura, like, she nails exactly what I'm about to say, so I want to send you to her because I'm just going to steal her thoughts. With the multi-level model or mixed models or all these approaches where you're mixing the ideographic and nomothetic, you are still assuming some sort of homogeneity, and then you're looking at the individual deviations from those homogeneous assumptions about covariance or trends or whatever the model's looking at. And I worry about that because I worry that the heterogeneity is too much to start with that assumption. And even something like, if people in the room are familiar with Katie Gates's Gimme, which is a little bit better in that regard, it's still, and Gimme's this vector autoregressive, anyways, it's a whole thing, and if you don't know it, I think I'm going to waste our time trying to explain it, but it starts with this core assumption in order for the model to work of these autoregressions that are held constant across everybody. So even there are these kind of linchpins that hold things together, these little bits of homogeneity that you have to assume. And I just personally want to be free of that and try to come bottom up, fully bottom up, and put it back together again from that side. That's just where I'm coming from, but yeah, it's one take.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for Aiden because he's not here, but Aiden writes, been doing stuff with Gimme, like closely associated with that group. So there's stuff like that in the literature, and maybe the meta point is like, why not let 1,000 flowers bloom if you have the resources and time to focus on it, right? So seriously, like, try stuff like this, try to publish it, see how it goes, and then we have these, enjoyable panel type events where we can talk about all of our experiences with trying these things and see how we can move the field forward, right? So that's kind of how I feel about it. I think my threshold is toward, like, just try stuff, right? And try to get it out there and try to have these discussions and just sort of try to stay engaged with, the potential to tackle some of these really challenging issues.
Yeah, if I can make a comment with regards to multi-level modeling, and modeling is one unique model per person. I think modeling one unique model per person would be better or preferred. You just need a lot of sample per person for that.
Right.
With multi-level modeling, you can borrow information from people.
Yeah.
That's a nice thing about multi-level modeling, but there are a lot of not nice things about multi-level modeling. It becomes really complicated. So that's still, it's very tricky still.
Next questions?
Hello, thank you very much. This is really a marvelous discussion, and I do think that the network approach brings like a new paradigm in our field. But I'm also a bit worried because we're here at the CBT conference, and this stuff is really cool. But I'm wondering more and more, what kind of problem are we actually trying to solve? So if we say, okay, science is very important, but as a researcher, I'm interested in a lot of fundamental issues. But I'm mostly, as a clinician, troubled by that we actually do not make a lot of progress in terms of our effect sizes do not increase for decades and decades. So I think that is maybe a priority, see how we can improve our effect sizes, or to make it maybe it's a bit more simple, at least try to create or develop interventions for people who do not respond. And we do know already for a long time with very, very simple prediction models, just baseline, who those people are. And I think network approach might bring something, but then we need to sort of maybe prioritize two things. First, what kind of network structures or characteristics are actually associated to course over time, to poor prognosis or poor response. Maybe that's the first thing to check out. Maybe it's centrality, maybe it's not. So this is something, if we do it together, I think we can sort it out maybe pretty soon. And of course, I see Sasha already smiling. Yeah, of course there are all kind of methodological issues, and you have to solve that. And another thing is, of course, is it indeed the case that if you target specific characteristics of networks, is it possible to target it, and does it change? And is that change indeed crucial to get to better outcomes? So maybe we have to direct, and maybe formulate like a bit of an urgency first in trying to study this before we get all excited about, ooh, patients really like to do it. Patients like to do a lot of new things. So, and that's of course very, very important, but maybe we have to slow down a bit and first try to check these like very clinical important questions before we get crazy and all are going to apply this approach.
Just one quick comment on Claudia's comment about the small effect sizes in the people that do receive these treatments. There's also another completely separate issue that takes us away from this panel, but it's at least as relevant. The treatments that we do have, some of them, as you pointed out, have been demonstrated as moderately effective for a long period of time. Most people, at least in this country, aren't even receiving those treatments. So we have a whole issue about dissemination of the treatments that even work moderately effective. That's a whole another enormous area if you look at it from the public health perspective. And now we have this dissemination science. There's people really trying to think about how can we get these things out. And one of the themes of this year's conference, I understand, is dealing with this issue of scalability, just in getting the treatments that are, halfway decent effective. So they're not incompatible problems, but they're quite distinct.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, so we published a paper in PNAS this summer. Said that the title was "Lack of Grouped Individual Generalizability is a Threat to Human Subjects Research," and that's quite a statement. But that's how I feel. My kind of barreling into idiography is because I just have this conviction that therapy is a process that unfolds within an individual, and then we should study it and measure it and model it at the level of the individual. 50 years from now, we might look back and say that paper was wrong and I was wrong, and I don't know. But I just feel convicted about that, because I feel conviction about that because that's where the processes are unfolding, and I feel compelled to chase them there. But I couldn't agree with you more. Suicide rates are going up, not down. Depression prevalence and incidence hasn't budged in, I think, 30 years. We got to do something. We got to do a better job.
Peter was. Go ahead, Evelyn. No, both of them sure are going to be fantastic questions. I'll be quick. Full disclosure, I'm one of Aaron's graduate students. One of the things I find most compelling about network analysis is the idea that, in clinical work, if we understood at a different level what's going on with our clients in our relations between symptoms or mechanisms, that we could intervene better, and that makes a lot of sense. But kind of to Rich's kind of fat hand problem point, there seems to be another assumption that if we understood the structure, we can monkey with it without changing the structure, that we could just turn down a node,
right,
but that wouldn't fundamentally change the organization of the network overall.
Right.
And so I'm curious if you have thoughts or comments about network seems like a great idea of, what's your first shot, but how do you kind of figure out what the next one is if the assumption is that the network could be completely different, even if you could theoretically just target one node?
Repeat the question.
I mean, part of the issue is, that's a hard problem. I think that one thing that we need to do is work more towards getting a framework to at least have directed networks. Because the way I think about it is we can think about the way we want to think about it is we want to think about there's something in a node and it emanates out. So we're really talking about not the structure of the network. We're talking about the flow of something through the network, right? So the depression to these nodes. And I think that's so right now I see that as maybe a limiting part of what the methodology can tell us, because we're not really to that point. So I don't know. But then you can talk about what if I stop this node, then you can think about water. If you think about a water that it's flow around it, right? So then you have to figure out how did you put stops? And the stops would be different treatments, targeting different pipelines, I guess, so kind of inside the network.
Yeah, so I think that what you're mentioning as well, that the networks now, they're nice for exploratory insight. There can be a stepping stone up to forming some theory, but then we need to form those theory. And I'm very excited about some work we've been doing last year, Don Robin now here in the room. Then we're doing very nice work of forming a computational model, the theoretical network, right? And then you can actually intervene on it and it actually can test those assumptions into something very different than the networks we have now. The networks we have now have very boring dynamics. They're usually stationary. Like a farm model is just a mean, it's fluctuates around the mean. Right? If you push somewhere, it just goes back to the mean. I think in clinical practice, I've been working a lot with University of Groningen, where they actually did this. They measured people, and I do this as well, of course. They measured people and estimated network and feedback to the patient. And what they said is that it's really nice as an extra tool. And you can actually ask the patients questions like, do you see yourself in this? Do you don't you see yourself in this? And you don't go to the patient and say, well, this is your network, deal with it. And then the patient might agree or not, and that can help together with the therapist and clinical expertise to form some treatment.
So if they disagree, they're just in psychodynamic denial. This is your network.
I mean, Aaron, you did show your networks to your patients, didn't you?
Yeah, well this
I've told this story a few times, but yeah, I mean, when we got our results back from our open trial, I had them on my laptop and I had lunch with Denny Borsboom, and I was really excited. Denny's a big hero, and I was really excited to show him my results, and I was going on this big spiel, and look what we found, and we had these amazing results. And he was like, yeah, no, those are pretty cool. And I was like, what? He said, well, so you showed these to the patients. Yeah, man, and they loved them, and they were like, yeah, that's what I do. And he's like, how do you know you didn't just ramp up expectancy? And I was like,
Why is that a bad
and what's
thing?
that? It's not a bad thing, but it's not what I'm saying I'm doing. So, it's just like, it's a big monkey wrench in the assumptions of what we did and why it worked, so. Because it says that you could just print up a network and just show it to someone and say, this is your network, and look, it's high tech and cutting edge, and they'll go, yeah, and then they'll get better.
I think that's part of the effector study.
Yeah.
Randomly give them networks that
No,
are.
I think for real, that's part of the effector study. And of course, somebody could do something clever like this, right? Like, not your network, but some network that's been randomized to you.
Right, and that's where
It is an expectancy effect, but I think that's part of what you're doing, right? I think that's part of why we're here, right? There's something about how we do things, like sort of business as usual, that's a little too flat relative to what we think we could achieve in psychotherapy in terms of understanding our patients. And so part of that is the enthusiasm around something that's novel, and I think that's a real effect, right? That what might be considered a placebo effect is part of what it is that you're doing.
Fair enough, sure.
Well, my question actually goes onto this, on this clinical implication. I'm from the University of Groningen, and we have been studying these networks also in clinical practice, but also doing focus studies on focus groups with patients to see whether they want this or not, or what do they get out of this, if they do experience something in daily life. So these are individualized models. And actually, if you look at what patients like, they already, by filling out the questions, they get insights on like, hey, on what type of, how do symptoms go together? When I'm ruminating, do I also have a sad mood or anything? And sometimes they're not interested in the whole network, but more at specific associations. So my question is also, do we always need a full network? Do you really need a network for this, or can we just talk about it and let people fill out questions about this? Do you really need a network representation?
It's important to acknowledge things about what, at least just speaking for myself, things that we're doing that aren't new. So I wrote a paper in JCCP in 2015, I think it was, and I said that I absolutely think this is a functional analytic perspective, just a quantified functional analytic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of the data collection for this stuff is just like self-monitoring. So another grad student of mine, Hannah Bosley, is in the room, and Hannah had a client in our study that came in for the first day of therapy and was like, I'm really excited for the next part of this treatment. And I was like, well, we haven't
given you any treatment yet, but this guy was psyched up about, the data collection he'd been doing on his phone, and you go look at the data, and his symptoms had gone way down. That's self-monitoring, right? We often open up CBT with self-monitoring, and so yeah. So I don't really have a good answer other than I just think that we need more research, we need more work, we need to be coming at this from as many angles as we can, figuring out, what's the signal, what's the noise, what comes from the methodology, what comes from expectancy, all those kinds of things. What do people need under what circumstances? It goes back to the Gordon Paul quote. It's just one of the best quotes of all time. What interventions, for what people, under what circumstances, yada yada. So, Paul, 1967. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a quick comment. So I don't have a clinical background, and then once I was a PhD student, I went to this clinical conference in the Netherlands. So I was thinking before we had like a lot of methodology, they had this talk, and I was like, yeah, you think about it in terms of networks. And afterwards, someone came to me and said, yeah, we've been doing that for 30 years already. That's what's been done. And think about how things relate to each other, how can you change the system. This is what I understand. So that's before you have pictures.
Yeah, but just following up on this one, sometimes what the network analysis can do, obviously, it can confirm the obvious and a well-established clinical wisdom. And if it didn't do that, we might be worried about whether we made some errors possibly in our computations. But it can also disclose connections that may not be so obvious to the patient as well until they actually see some of the data and start thinking about that. Interpersonal behaviors and things of this sort that might be where they're actually inadvertently doing things that are inciting some of the problems that feed back into the larger system in which they're embedded. And so I think on the one hand, they have the potential of confirming the obvious, which builds some confidence in their own interpretation of the problems, but also may disclose some functional relations that are not quite as obvious to them upon reflection. And so I think it can work both ways.
So I have a comment about the between and within, but I think it also relates to the self-monitoring. So Aaron you had said how when you aggregated the data, it looked like nomothetic models, and then you get it. So I think an important part is what does aggregate mean? And that typically with cross-sectional data, we're actually asking the participants to subjectively aggregate. Like, how have you felt the past 2 weeks? That's an aggregation problem, but it's subjective. And then if you've got, say, daily data, then you can objectively aggregate it, but you can objectively aggregate it in different ways. You could take the average, you could take the peak, you could take the end. And so I think those aggregation processes themselves could be nomothetic or could be idiographic, but they impact the network or factor structure that you get when you look at aggregated versus idiosyncratic data, idiographic data.
That's a fantastic point. I mean, I'm just curious now to look. So what we did, just to clarify, what we did was we estimated variance covariance matrices for each person. And some people in the room might not be aware. You can just arithmetic. You can just average those. You can take an aggregate of covariance matrices just like you can vectors of data. So because these were time series, I didn't know what I should aggregate. Right? Because I was struck with that. It's like I could take the first observation, I could take the last, I could take the max, the min, right? So I instead estimated covariance matrices for each person that takes the whole information and I aggregated that. And it'd be an interesting question if I found the same thing taking the mean or the max or the min. So all I have right here is just that's a really great point, right? And they would tell you different things. So thank you.
Other questions, thoughts?
First of all, thanks for a great talk. But I was actually wondering, I had some interesting conversations with both Aidan Wright and Mary Forbes at SRP this year about how to choose variables to use for network analysis and some of the limitations of using specific symptom level variables with things like item response bias, or like we're talking about with the high alphas between similar symptoms and potentially using like symptom subscales as variables in an analysis to potentially kind of improve some of those psychometric issues. But then there's kind of this trade-off of like, at least with my hearing and my understanding of network analysis, that kind of deviates from this very core symptom causes symptom relationship. So I was just wondering if I could hear you guys' kind of views or thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on your theory of things, and also your theory on what are the causal agents. If you think the causal agents are disorders, for example, you have to use latent variables. In personality networks, I personally like to use facets as nodes rather than the individual items, because I think I can interpret something like aggression or something like that. And it really depends on that. You have methodology to do that. You can put anything in the network and make it a network, or you can actually model latent variables within that perspective as well, or within that model as well. But it really depends on what you think. If you think the symptoms are the causal agents, then I think you should model the symptoms.
So I'll go out on a limb and say that the rhetoric that you're referring to in your question, I think, has been deeply problematic. And I do hope that Denny regrets that, right? I think that that's not the way to think about this stuff, right? That there's some contrast between latent variables and manifest variables that somehow, there's this deep ontological unity to latent variables. Nobody really thinks that, right? And certainly we don't think it when we do the kind of genomic inquiry that I was referring to. There are, thousands of relevant SNPs. We don't see that there's one causal thing, right? That there's this deep ontological unity to latent variables. And Sasha's done very nice work on applying in a direct sense, where everything's being estimated at the same time in the Psychometrica paper, network analysis of latent variables that have multiple indicators within one, sort of data set that's being fit all at once, or all those parameters are being fit at the same time. So the point I guess I'm trying to make is there's nothing wrong, and Doug said something similar earlier, Sasha just said it also, with thinking that the indicator variables for a quote-unquote network analysis are themselves latent aggregated variables, right? So for example, a scale that has multiple items on it is conceptually a latent variable, right? Relative to saying that it must be the case that the indicators for this sort of analysis must be dichotomous manifest variables. That makes very little sense to me. And because as our group is published on, right? So like Mary and Aiden and Christian, Marcon and I have been working together on this stuff. Because that doesn't work very well, right? There's not a whole lot of Fisher information in dichotomous indicator variables, and there's all kinds of issues that arise when you work with those kinds of variables having to do with, imbalanced skew, and in psychopathology that just gets all the worse because they're, not very common. So everything about that is bad, quantitatively. I mean, I get why we have those kinds of data available to us and why people would be excited to try these sorts of approaches with it. But yeah, I think the way forward, and I think this is sort of Doug's insight too, is maybe we can do a better job measuring these more molecular individual differences that constitute our diagnostic criteria sets. And in doing so, we might have indicator variables that have better distributional properties. And in having those kinds of better indicator variables, some of the inferences that we want to make about, partial relationships among them net of the other ones, right, which is kind of the essence of where the leverage of network analysis as traditionally applied to cross-section data is coming from, that's all going to be better, right? So I think that rhetoric is problematic. I mean, Denny's not here to speak for himself, but I think that original rhetoric has really been very misleading in terms of how ultimately this stuff works. Not to mention that there are cases in which there's a true fungibility between things that are called network analysis and things that are called latent variable models, right? So there are some cases in which the models are the same model, so that kind of thing happens too. And so I think the rhetoric has just been really problematic. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll quickly comment on that. I can't speak for Danny, and I don't know if he regrets anything. Yeah, I always think that if you model something with a structural equation modeling, and you draw like circles and lines, and also an error on there, and a residual, that means that you're assuming this thing causes something, because otherwise you wouldn't assume residual. This is a philosophical issue, and this is really deeply debated in the STEM literature as well. These things are causal or not. If you interpret them as simply a summary measure, I don't know what the value is of the summary of this cost the summary of that. But you can do that. You can also use a network if you don't believe that the symptoms are causal agents. It's not necessarily assumption for this. I actually think that these networks are very useful to just get instantly the data set. And there's a very interesting work from Hudson Galina where they use a network and then they look at the clustering and they say, okay, so these are latent variables. And they use actually as a tool in latent variable analysis, which is which you can do. You don't need to assume that these symptoms are causal. That you're really gonna, if you just use the disclosure model.
So on that note, we are out of time. Thank you so much for all of you for attending and to our amazing panelists.